Welcome to Movies Are Life. I'm your host, Nathan Chandler. And although Halloween is over, just one day late, we're diving deep into the realms of horror as we explore one of the most iconic and controversial films in cinematic history. That's right, we're turning back the pages of time and summoning the dark forces to discuss none other than The Exorcist. This iconic film is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and with the recent passing of its revered director, William Friedkin, I thought it was a perfect time to revisit this horror staple. I'm super excited that I was able to convince my good buddy, Brad McLelland, to take a break from writing his next novel to come in and discuss this film. How are you doing, Brad?
I'm good. How are you, Nathan? It's so good to be here with you again.
Yeah, I occasionally message you and you're like, man, I'm really, staying dedicated to the writing and I'm doing this. And then I wanted to do this movie and I was like, maybe I'll get him with this one. And I did. I was able to get you.
You did. I could not turn down a discussion of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
I was unable to do that.
Yeah. Brad was one of our first guests on this podcast where we discussed the movie X. And you haven't seen Pearl yet, right?
No, I have not seen Pearl, and I'm really eagerly awaiting the moment when it arrives at Hulu or wherever.
Yeah,
that I can get that. Yeah.
I've been a little surprised it hasn't popped up on one of those services yet.
Yeah, I've been watching for it, but I may just have to break down and rent it.
Yeah.
But I really want to see it because I really loved X, as you know.
I got it at the our local library. I don't know if yours.
Oh.
I don't know how Ponca City's library is.
I don't know. I will check into that. I often forget that's a thing that you can do.
Yeah. There you go.
To rent movies like your local Blockbuster, but only with a lot of books.
Yeah. And even though I think of you as as far as horror films go, I mean, you like other genres as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up on action movies. The only thing that I kind of shrug about a little bit are the rom-coms that my wife wants to watch on a Saturday night. She likes the feel good stuff and the laugh out loud stuff. And I kind of reluctantly will be like, okay, I was really hoping to hit you with something like Martyrs, or something hardcore, but oh well, we can do another Sandra Bullock night.
So you haven't been following along with our 50 best rom-com series?
I have not. I mean, I can. But I think I like to follow your horror stuff a little bit more. It's just my taste.
Okay. Yeah, there's no problem with that. That's why we cover it all. We do rom-coms and then we do the extreme like this movie, The Exorcist.
You do you, man. You do you. All good.
Well, without further ado, let's venture into the heart of darkness as we discuss this film that changed the face of horror forever.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness.
The Exorcist is a 1973 American supernatural horror film directed by William Friedkin from a screenplay by William Blatty, based on his 1971 novel of the same name. The film stars Ellen Burstyn, Max von Sydow, Jason Miller, and Linda Blair. The story follows the demonic possession of a young girl and her mother's attempt to rescue her through an exorcism of two Catholic priests. The Exorcist was released in 24 theaters in the United States on December 26, 1973. Reviews were mixed, but audiences waited in long lines during cold weather to see this film. So I wanted to take a little break from this description. It released on the day after Christmas.
Yes. How insane is that, right?
Yeah. Well, I saw that like Fathom Events does, certain movie anniversary releases. And so I think it recently happened. One, I think to correlate with the new Exorcist movie that was released, but also, I mean, Halloween, October, so I just thought like when I saw December 26th, I was like, well, that's an interesting choice.
Isn't that just the weirdest time to put out The Exorcist of all time? I mean, I'm sure that the theater was still decked out in, their holiday stuff. I mean, can you only imagine? It's like,
yeah. So when it was released, it almost has this folklore of viewers suffered adverse physical reactions to the movie, including fainting or vomiting, to many shocking scenes. And I'm sure we'll go into that a little bit, but you hear those stories. I always kind of wonder, really, like, how true to form they are, or if maybe that's maybe some of the marketers behind the movies kind of playing up those stories. I don't know.
You tend to hear these kinds of stories with the more extreme movies in general.
Yeah.
Like I actually remember hearing stories of movie theater goers and even a pregnant woman going into labor with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when it was released, if you recall those stories.
Yeah.
I think Texas Chainsaw was one of them. The Exorcist is the famous one. There are more. I believe Halloween has some interesting stories that have come out of like theatrical experiences and people, just completely freaking out, Yeah. So who knows how truthful they are, but I do know that there's really amazing YouTube clips of people going in to see The Exorcist and then coming out. So you can actually view that stuff on YouTube in sort of like, limited ways. Whatever they were able to catch from audience perspectives back then, they did catch it.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of freakified faces coming out of that. Like, I'm not going back in.
Yeah.
I hate that in there. It feels weird.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. In the kind of research, several cities attempted to ban this movie outright or prevent children from attending. But at the end of its original theatrical run, the film grossed $193 million. And at this time, it has had a lifetime gross of $441 million with a lot of re-releases and things like that. The cultural conversation around the film helped it become the first horror film to be nominated for Best Picture. Blatty won for Best Adapted Screenplay, while sound engineers took the award for Best Sound. It's spawned several sequels and was the highest grossing R-rated horror film until it came along a couple of years ago. It's had a significant influence on pop culture, and several publications regarded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. So do you believe that, Brad? Is this one of the greatest horror films ever made?
Yeah. So I knew you were going to ask me this, and that's a hard question because I'm such a hardcore John Carpenter fanatic that I always tend to think, something like Halloween may be the greatest, or I don't know. It's hard to pin down the greatest, but in terms of what it achieved, what it's still achieving, how many ripoffs came out afterward that tried to emulate the success and the freakish nature of it, you cannot deny that even at the cultural perspective of it, like just looking at it as a cultural phenomenon, it has achieved something hardly any other horror movie has ever done. And when you go back and watch it and really kind of dive into it, I did a deep dive analysis of this movie in college, actually, for a paper on its music when I was taking movie music. And you start noticing sort of the more brilliant hidden aspects of the filmmaking itself. So some of that stuff I'd love to touch on today, but yeah, I think it is. I really do. I think it might be probably maybe the best horror movie ever made. I'm just going to put it out there. People might say Psycho, people might say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but what this movie has achieved has far surpassed any of those.
Yeah. There's definitely, as I mentioned, William Friedkin passed away not that long ago, but is known for other films besides The Exorcist. But I mean, there's definitely artistic touch to this movie, even as shocking as a lot of the things that are in it, but, really it being nominated for Best Picture. I was just sitting here, I was trying to think of any other kind of horror type movies that have even touched that. Maybe you could say Silence of the Lambs, but that's kind of, that's kind of more suspense / horror. So, I mean, really it's like, there hasn't really been another horror movie like this that's even touched those categories, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Best Picture, Best Director, things like that, I mean, it kind of swept it, really, didn't it? I also cannot remember off the top of my head any other horror movie making that sort of achievement at the Oscars, but I may be wrong. I mean, something could have come along. I know that we're getting a lot of innovative new horror these days. I recently, one of my recent favorites was the Australian movie Talk to Me. I thought Talk to Me was really excellent and, achieved some really brilliant things in that movie. But I don't know if it would ever win Best Picture.
Right. Yeah.
or best adapted screenplay or something like that. So this just achieved sort of an iconic status right out of the gate. People understood what it was doing at deep levels. It was affecting everyone from the religious community to, just society in general. It was really creeping in there.
Yeah.
Just did amazing things.
Yeah. So knowing that you've done a research paper on this, like kind of ballpark, like how many times do you think you've seen this movie?
Oh man, that's a very darned good question, because I tend to revisit The Exorcist at least once every couple of years.
Okay.
And if I count the numerous times I saw it in college, just to, backtracking things that I may have missed just to write my paper. And then I would watch it with my family. I have one very memorable Exorcist watch with my family, by the way, which was really funny. I should tell you about that today. I probably have seen it, I'm going to say 20 to 25 times.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. That's a ballpark figure, but I think it's really close to how many times I've seen The Exorcist.
Yeah. You probably should guide this conversation then, because I'm pretty sure the first time I saw this was in college. It's kind of when I watched like everything. And so this was probably my only second time to see it, and it's one of those movies, you see so many clips elsewhere, it kind of fills in those gaps. So even watching it the second time, there were a couple of things I didn't remember about it, but like as a whole, as far as the big set pieces and stuff like that, I mean, it's a movie that sticks with you. So, it felt very familiar, even though I had forgotten some aspects to it.
Oh yeah. It's ingrained in all of our collective consciousnesses now. I mean, you can't deny that. Like, I think if you were to say the words The Exorcist, automatically you're going to see Linda Blair's face. You're going to see the pea soup vomit. You're going to see all that stuff in your mind's eye. Just like when you say the words Halloween now, chances are a movie buff is going to immediately see Michael Myers mask. You're going to see little clips there. It's hard to avoid. I mean, it got saturated. It got oversaturated. People tried to emulate it. But the imagery alone in that movie just reigns supreme. I don't know. There's something about it that feels cold and calculating. Mm-hmm. And, the whole idea of the movie production being cursed, there's so much lore around it. It's just a fun film to think about and explore, as a creative person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say, like, probably the second time it wasn't, I mean, I remember my first viewing of it, like being pretty like, and I'm not someone who necessarily says I'm scared throughout a film. I think there are scary moments in a film. I think this is a rare horror movie where you're like tense throughout versus like, even in the scenes that are like kind of breathe a little bit, there's just this layer of like dread, and so versus like if you watched, like a Scream type movie, I mean, one of its appeals is that you do get to take big breaths of like, okay, here's the scary scene. Now they're all, kind of joking around, daylight, that sort of thing.
Here's the high school hallway scene.
Yeah. And so, but I will say the second time around, I mean, I think I was able to probably focus more on the themes that it's trying to get across versus I can't say I was really like scared. I don't know if that was part of like just knowing what the outcome would be, maybe part of it of seeing, Reagan's head spin around so many times, whether it was from this movie or being spoofed in other movies, things like that, Oh, as I said that, your cat like jumped up behind
you. my black demonic familiar cat there. Yeah, Ophelia likes to watch.
It literally just made me kind of jump a little bit.
Thanks, Ophelia. That was perfect timing.
Yeah, it was good timing. So like maybe talk about like what I mean. I think we can both agree that the visuals and the things that happen definitely stick with you. But as far as the thematic stuff, I think it's very interesting with just the battle between not necessarily good or evil, but just like that crisis of faith that's happening in this movie.
Yeah, good versus evil, crisis of faith. I mean, so just to back up 1 second and talk about an oversaturation effect, that unfortunately, most of the horror market for the past 20 years has been very formulaic. And so I tend to think of Hollywood and movie making as almost mathematics now for those people. They tend to stick to the formulas that they know will bring in the teen money and the certain demographics money. And they stick to that formula over and over again. And sometimes they'll try to outshock each other within the confines of that same formula. So you've got the teen screams, you've got, the Saw franchise movies, you got the torture porn, but it's all very formulaic. And that's why you have those moments when you feel like you can breathe versus you feel like you're about to get grossed out versus, okay, here comes the obligatory jump scare. What The Exorcist does well is this was back before, clearly, we've had horror movies from, the 1900s onward. With the silent film era, with Nosferatu, with Dracula and the Universal monsters, nothing was new, but The Exorcist came along and did things that, that accentuated the themes of it extremely well. So that's why I think it's got staying power. I think the use of its effects, although they're shocking, are not the thing that makes it stick in a person's mind. I think what makes it stick in a person's mind when they watch it, especially the first time, is that feeling that, okay, I don't really know what I believe anymore, and there might be things hiding behind the scenes, and I think that people walked out of that movie feeling a little extra cold and a little extra knowledgeable that maybe there might be a spiritual element to life and living and death. And, no matter what you believe, I think that theme of there is a battle going on sort of like silently between the cracks, that is a really cosmic horror kind of theme. And it is, in fact, cosmic horror is kind of an interesting little side theme that gets explored, which I want to talk to you about in The Exorcist, which is kind of interesting. But I don't know, the themes just kind of like they're subtle, but they'll really jump out at you at the end. The good versus evil again. You mentioned the crisis of faith. That is a huge one, because nearly everyone in the movie has a somewhat of a crisis of faith, or they're atheistic. Or they don't believe one thing versus the other. Truly, the only what I would deem as the most pure of faiths is Father Marin, who comes back from northern Iraq knowing he's got to face evil, and he's the one who faces down the shadows, and he understands his mission, whereas Father Karras didn't understand it. He thought it was psychological at first. He thought exorcism was kind of a joke from the medieval centuries and things like that. But the more they delve into it and the more audiences delve into it, the more people like Karras and the audience begin to understand the gravity of what they're facing at the same time, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah. And I think partially what makes this movie so frightening is like even other horror movies. Often many of the characters don't deserve what happens to them. So I'm not saying that, but there's been some kind of action to lead whatever happening to them, whether it's like, oh, I shouldn't have opened that box, or I shouldn't have gone into that haunted house or something like that. This one solely is like, it just really kind of just happens to this poor family.
It's so chaotic. It's just chaos. It's chaotic,
and there's no, this movie doesn't even really grapple with the issue of like, it's more about like what is happening versus like why it's happening.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of your modern Exorcist type stories go wrong, is that they try to cram you with these, religious themes of like, this is happening because of this. But in The Exorcist, you get no answers. There's no answer for why a priest would become possessed at the end.
Yeah.
There's no answer for that. It was just that he was self-sacrificial in the end, and that's what happened. And there's no answer for why it chose Reagan, for example. or how it even got into the house, or how it even got the notion to get into Reagan and begin the weird little trippy Captain Trips thing or Captain Howdy thing that it had going on with her. It's just so randomized. That's what makes it so frightening to me.
Yeah. So my mind went into a little different avenues. This is real, but I mean, I think Linda Blair is just terrific in this movie. And I was kind of reading about how, it came out that like somebody else dubbed her like demonic voice, and Linda Blair was nominated for an Oscar for this role. And people seem to have like a real big quibble that it wasn't her voice. And I was, with that knowledge, I was watching this going like, I don't care. Like, are you seeing all the like physical things she's having to do? I just thought it was funny that people were like, "Oh, she didn't deserve that nomination because it wasn't her voice."
Yeah, exactly. She broke her spine making this movie. I mean, what else do you want?
Yeah, but that's something. I mean, definitely. I think watching it now that I definitely connected with a lot more is that I think any parent has probably been in some kind of frightening situation where you feel like you don't have control. And so now, watching this movie now, like really connected with Ellen Burstyn's character in this movie. Because I mean, just her just trying to just figure out like what's happening and what's wrong, and I almost thought the more frightening scenes were all the hospital scenes versus I was like, because we thankfully have never had to go through that with one of our kids, but we have had like surgeries that happen, and even very standard procedure type of things. It's a very frightening ordeal to like hand your child off to a doctor to do whatever when you're not there. And so those scenes almost are like, to me, more like nauseating.
I get it. I totally get it. I mean, having a now 13-year-old and I believe you have a 12-year-old. Reagan,
she just turned 13.
Oh, just turned. Okay. I mean, even still, Reagan is 12 years old in this movie.
Yeah.
And just to see her cooped up in the hospital, and you talk about the nauseating aspect of the hospital scenes. Ironically, that's actually one of the things that caused a lot of the nausea in movie theater goers, was apparently the hospital stuff where they were doing the procedure.
Yeah,
had to go through her neck and it was spurting blood, and a lot of people couldn't handle that level of a gore, I guess, happening to a young person like that. And then it just, everything got amplified when she started spewing the pea soup, and it just got worse and worse and worse. But yeah, you're right. The hospital scenes are just horrifying. My stepdaughter broke her arm a couple of years ago during a gymnastics practice, and we rushed over there, and she was just lying calmly on the ground waiting for the paramedics, but her arm was an L. It was a just complete L at the forearm. And seeing that, there's something in me just shattered. I was like, I would give anything for you not to have to be going through this. Right now.
Yeah.
And so, yes, to become a stepfather, or for you to be a father, or for a mother to watch this movie, brings a completely different layer, a thematic layer of motherhood, fatherhood, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned lack of control. Hell yeah. I mean, it's like that. Just, you don't want anything bad happening to your loved one. And you can't think of anything more horrible happening than, a little case of demonic possession.
Just a little case.
Just a little case.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things about this movie that stand out. I think the acting, I think the cinematography, the effects. I mean,
sound design.
Yeah, sound design. So much. I mean, what really stands out to you the most?
Oh gosh. Okay, so I'll try not to rabbit hole this discussion, because this was sort of my research paper's focus. What really was the sound design element of it, and the use of music, and the minimal use of music, actually. But I think one of my favorite sequences is actually the prologue, where Father Merrin is in northern Iraq. The things that happen there with sound, and with lack of sound, and with lack of music, and then music coming in, coupled with the cinematography, really sets up everything just absolutely brilliantly. And I don't think a lot of people realize how perfect and how important the prologue to The Exorcist really is. You know, there's a moment, and then I've got another kind of favorite moment that kind of mirrors a little bit of what's going on. I don't know, that Iraq scene, if you watch it, there's minimal music in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You hear tiny little pieces of like very odd, like acidic sounding, like just crazy kind of like strings kind of screaming at one another at times. Most of it though is the churning of iron. You'll hear like the hitting of iron on iron, you know, people hitting things, squealing sounds, just weird, odd, like almost like sounds of chaos. And it starts with that sort of like Middle Eastern sound, and then it goes very quiet as they're discovering this thing in the sand, which is actually the image of Pazuzu, this demon. And as soon as that dig happens, all of the sound just cuts out and everything gets very quiet. And when Father Merrin finally decides that he has to go confront evil, that there's some sort of weird omen calling him to battle, there's literally no sound in the scene that follows when he's walking through this particular holy place where you see people who are bowing facing Mecca. You can't hear footsteps. You can't hear people talking to one another. You can only hear a light shuffle of his feet. And it's almost like the calm before the storm, right?
Yeah.
And then as soon as he leaves the holy place, it's back to the clanging of metal, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. It gets more and more chaotic. The sound intensifies. He almost gets run over by this grotesque looking woman in a wagon, and things screech and things are squealing, and you see like fire coming up from molten lava as people are doing something at a forge. It's just chaos. It's chaos personified. And then it just like cuts out and you hear quiet again. He's walking into the desert. And I don't know if you know much about the Pazuzu lore of this Mesopotamian demon, but this particular demon was an ancient Mesopotamian personification of the southeastern wind. The southwestern wind, apparently. And so he's like this demon of wind. And the second that the sound cuts out of the prologue and he's sort of about to face off with the giant version of the statue, and you see sort of that stark comparison between his shadow and that one, the wind is blowing in his face. You hear it's little moments like that make it almost perfect for me, that it was a perfect prologue. It's setting up this battle between good and evil. A lot of it's going to be chaos. A lot of it's going to be quiet. But all of it is going to be this face-off between good and evil. And I've got other theories about Pazuzu and, you know, things that might cook your noodle, but I don't know if we'll have time to go into it. But another scene, if I may, that I really like was the psychiatric ward where Father Karras goes in to see his mother after she's been admitted into the ward right before she dies. I think a lot of really interesting foreshadowing and foretelling and thematic stuff is happening there the second he walks into that room. So if you go back in and watch, you'll notice that every other character in the ward is a woman, right? And they all basically swarm Father Karras.
Right.
They get around Father Karras and they're touching him and they're trying to grab at him, and he's very annoyed. This is a man who has a crisis of faith going on right now, and his beloved mother, who is the only person he has in his life, really, is dying, and she's been admitted into this ward, and you have all these women begging for his help. And one of them reaches up, if you notice, it's a very subtle moment, and grabs his white priest's collar and yanks it out and stuffs it into her mouth. Almost as like she's wanting to imbibe him, right? Like wanting to drink him in or eat whatever he has that will help her. And it's almost a foreshadowing later of the fact that a woman will beg for his help. And when he goes to face off the demon in Reagan, Reagan spews on his collar. Yeah. All of this stuff happens. And so there are these brilliant little side moments, these very quiet moments that happen almost like a blink of an eye in The Exorcist, that if you're not watching it because you're waiting for the big demon moments, you're going to miss some truly spectacular filmmaking moments, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I find that a lot of the sub themes get missed, I think, by general audiences, and themes of gender, you know, are all over this movie.
Yeah. That was something I would say I had forgotten about, was this whole kind of side story between him and his mother, and how prevalent that is in this movie. I mean, it's not quite half and half. You might be surprised that that's probably kind of close, actually. But yeah, that was definitely an element that I had forgotten about for sure. So
and you wonder why it's so important to the story. Why would his dying mother be that important to force us to sit and watch these long scenes of pure quiet where nothing is going on, where there's no action, until you get into the dark room with Reagan and in the possession moments, and the demon is spewing all these lies about the mom being down in hell.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Karras has already been suffering this crisis of faith, and he has to listen to this demon talking about this beloved woman who just died, suffering eternal, you know, suffering in hell. And every little inch of that was designed to shake Karras down to his bones, you know. And just goes to show you how powerful the characters really are, and how self-sacrificial he really was in the end. So every little tiny moment in The Exorcist contributes to the whole.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people realize that when they first watch it as a general audience, you know.
Yeah, no, yeah, I definitely agree. This is kind of random, but do you think it's weird that we don't see Burke die? Chris McNeil's boyfriend slash director. Yeah. I mean, it's always talked about. Yeah, it's always talked about, like, what happened. And do you think that was, you know, I don't know. I wanted to get your opinion if that was maybe a budgetary decision, or if it just added to the fact that you don't really know what happened.
One of these kind of plays into some weird theories I have about The Exorcist. And so I'll talk about one of these. So do you remember at the McNeil party at the very beginning of the movie, Chris is throwing this big extravagant, you know, hoopla with a, you know, the director there and a lot of folks who are showing up wanting sort of a piece of her. And Burke is there and he's just blitzed. You remember how drunk he gets, right? Well, there is a really quiet moment in that party where Burke actually calls Chris's caretaker a Nazi. Okay?
Yeah.
Just straight up calls this guy. I think his name was Carl. Carl was the caretaker in the movie, and he says, "I'm Swiss. I'm from Sweden. I'm Swiss." And he's like, "Yeah, you damn Nazi," or whatever.
Yeah.
It's such a weird moment, right? But it's and then you don't see Burke die. It almost kind of makes you wonder if you didn't see Burke die because the director, the writer, wanted you to think that maybe, just maybe, in theory land, you know, Carl had something to do with it, because, you know, was he really a Nazi? Apparently the theories are that Carl is the one who puts the crucifix underneath the pillow.
Okay.
And all that stuff. So, you know, so he had been in the room, and he apparently understood that Reagan was possessed, this German guy who's the caretaker of this house. And he's such an ignored character. Yeah. Nobody ever truly walks out of there going, was that guy a Nazi? Was that a Nazi living in Chris McNeil's house and like helping with but Burke is the only one in the movie to call him out on it during a drunken rage stupor in this party. And he's like, you butcherer, things like that. And then all of a sudden, like a few scenes later, he's dead and you don't see why.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It kind of makes you wonder if there's like, you know, maybe a little nod to the fact that maybe, you know, Carl either saw it happen because he had been in the room, Or he pushed him himself. You never know. I mean, he may have been a Nazi.
What do you think? I mean, there's a lot of them, but what do you think is the scariest scene from this movie?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. It's none of the, I wouldn't say it's any of the pure exorcism moments where they're battling the demon. I wouldn't even say it's the moments when the extremisms of the movie come out, like the spewing of the pee vomit, all that stuff. I don't think that's the scary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think the scary stuff is when Regan is asleep with the demon in her, and Chris comes into the room and it's quiet and cold.
Yeah.
And you are at that moment, you are so steeped in dread that you have no idea what to expect. A modern audience would demand that the demon reach up and strangle her at that moment, but that's not what you get. You just get this quiet moment where this mother walks in to check on her daughter, knowing what is inside her at this point, or maybe, thinking who knows what, and then looking up and seeing what is it, help me, burned into her flesh.
Yeah. Something
like that. I think that might be one of the scariest moments for me, or the moment when Father Karras is by himself and really wrestling with that moment of that crisis of faith, and seeing his mother waving in the subways, trying to get his help. And, there are those little, the shock value moments are glamorized as like, pop horror stuff.
Yeah.
But it's those little moments like that that really make it memorable, I think.
Yeah. And I had forgotten, I meant to actually time it. I'm sure it's out there on the internet somewhere, but like how long that exorcism scene is, with the two priests in there. Just, wow. I mean, I would guess maybe 20 minutes or so. I mean, long enough that even there's like almost like a halftime.
There is.
Yeah. But the power
for everybody.
Yeah. The power of Christ compels you. I mean, a lot, that's where that famous line comes from and everything. But man, just because prior to that, a lot of the scenes, the things happen, but almost kind of comically. So where it would then just cut to, a different scene. And I kept thinking of like, what happened after all the furniture went after her? Like, which a lot of scary movies do, they have these big moments and then, they just cut away. I'm always like, so what happened after that? Like, but anyway,
put the room back together.
Yeah. But certainly the last scene and just how that all plays out is just very, very effective, because you're like, oh, okay, we are gonna be here for a minute.
It's not just a wham bam, thank you, ma'am, we're done here. It's like this is a catechism that they have to go through, and they they have to slowly, methodically do this. And in fact, doesn't Father Marin die quietly, slumped over somewhere? He doesn't even die hugely like by the demon. He just passes away from his cardio arrhythmia or whatever he's got going on. So it's just little brilliant moments like that where it's like, wow, okay, there is a little pause in the exorcism. They have to go rest. They got to go clean themselves up. It's so not sexy, It's like all of the horror movies these days at least attempt a version of like really cool, we're gonna grab you with this explosive ending that's gonna look just damn good. But The Exorcist was vomit on you, cold. We're gonna walk away for a while. No music is gonna play. It just steeps the audience right there. I mean, it just puts you in that room with them so well. It's creepy stuff. So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you know about the astronaut?
No.
The Exorcist?
No.
Oh, this is an amazing little piece. So back to the party. You may not have been aware that there was an astronaut at the party that ends up being a recurring character for William Peter Blatty, the novelist. So while if you analyze that party, if you go back there, and the reason I analyzed it is because I was really confused in earlier viewings of The Exorcist why Regan would go downstairs and say, "You're going to die up there," and then pee all over the place.
Yeah.
Like, what did that mean? Did that mean that when you all get to heaven, you're all going to experience death? Or what did she mean? She was talking to an astronaut that was at the party. And his name was Captain Billy Cutshaw.
Okay.
If you look into this, it's true story. His name is Billy Cutshaw. He shows up in William Peter Blatty's next novel called The Ninth Configuration, which he ended up directing.
Okay.
And getting very good accolades for, by the way. He wrote and directed 3 movies, or was part of 3 books, rather. I'm sorry. And he calls those his trilogy of faith books.
Okay.
The first being The Exorcist. The next was Legion, which The Exorcist 3 was based on.
Okay.
And then he wrote The Ninth Configuration. And The Ninth Configuration is about this astronaut named Billy Cutshaw, or he's one of the characters, who has a crisis moment where he breaks down, has a mental breakdown, and aborts a moon mission. Okay. This is after the events of The Exorcist.
Okay.
So here you have a demon-possessed child coming downstairs, looking at an astronaut, telling him, "You're going to die up there."
Okay.
And then in the next novel, he aborts a moon mission because of a nervous breakdown.
Oh.
Yeah, it's amazing. The connections are amazing. So what Blatty did was, when he realized that The Exorcist was so popular, and with the success of The Exorcist, he went back and revised his next novel after The Exorcist to kind of like up the themes of crises of faith and science versus, belief and things like that. So it was another crisis of faith kind of story where this other astronaut is trying to understand Billy Cutshaw, and they get into shenanigans together. But it's a really interesting moment, right? It's like, I always wondered why Reagan was saying that and to whom she was saying it to. But then you've got this guy who's talking in the corner at one point to a priest, and he's like, "Oh, don't worry, Father. It's not really as bad as you think. Not like the other missions." And this one priest who happens to know Father Karras says, "Hey, the next time you go up there, take me with you. They could use missionaries on Mars." And things like that. So it's just this tiny little moment, but it speaks volumes for William Peter Blatty's world that he created. It's like this recurring character. Isn't that wild?
Yeah. Yeah. I would definitely probably rethink some things if I was placed in that situation. So
I'm not going to go to the moon after a demon-possessed child tells me I'll die up there.
Yeah.
Movie Musings.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I don't know, and this could go into really deep territory, but on a surface level, I guess you say, do you believe in the battle of good versus evil?
Oh, Nathan, that's big. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I definitely have in the past. I grew up, I think we've talked about this before. I grew up I think actually we touched on this when we talked about X, the way we grew up in religious households. I grew up as a Baptist, and we religiously went to church. I was taught up until I was a young man in college that, good versus evil battles exist. The spiritual plane is out there. It exists, so talk to God frequently and, eschew the devil and all things evil. As I've matured and as I've gone on through life and as I've reanalyzed and as I've doubted things that I've learned in the past, it's a complex issue in my mind. Every now, I guess you might consider my particular beliefs now on good versus evil as more humanistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that humans have, capacity for great good and evil, and the way we fight that is pretty telling.
Yeah.
You can look at it in our politics. You can look at it going on overseas right now. I mean, there's definite good versus evil. Now, who's good versus who's evil is the problem. Nobody really knows anymore. It's so blurry. In terms of a spiritual warfare, though, I mean, you never know. I mean, it's unseen. People say they believe in it wholeheartedly. I used to believe in it. I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I guess if I had that particular ability to peel back the layers of our reality and see the spirit plane, I would definitely be a believer. But yeah, what about yourself?
Man, you probably framed it better than I could. I think that's a really good outlook to have it. I think that there definitely is. I think often what the problem becomes is people trying to diagnose what is good and what is evil, and that gets those lines start getting blurred almost.
Consider the sources usually, right?
Right. Yeah, and so I definitely think it does. I think definitely where we kind of allocate our focus onto what that is and what that means can be construed a lot. But I do, and I always don't want to say that it's not a serious thing to consider and stuff like that. But I do think if it is something that dictates your whole life and how you perceive life, that can be very hindering. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the big problems with religion as a whole is like when you allow yourself to believe firmly that higher powers, whether good or evil, are guiding everything we do, then you are more prone as a human to take yourself out of the equation in terms of decision making, in terms of the way you treat a person. I think we all have human responsibility. And I think that religion tends to tell people you don't have to be responsible because there are these higher forces at work and you just have to be guided by those. And if you're not guided by the right ones, then damn all the rest of them because they're wrong, right? That's a problem for me. That's a big problem. So, going, I guess tying this back to The Exorcist, it's basically Chris O'Neill's path. Chris McNeil's path, rather. That's the one that she's following probably even more than Father Karras. I mean, he had sort of this roundabout way of coming back to religion, right? I mean, he took the hard way. He goes to Jesuit school. He believes in helping people, but then he turns to science. He starts disbelieving just a little bit because he sees proof in science and not in the spirit. And all of a sudden, boom, he's thrust into a spiritual conflict again. Well, if you look at Chris McNeil's journey as a mother, she undergoes an even more morbid transformation. I mean, she's thrust into this situation where she was an atheist, didn't believe in any of that, never went to Jesuit school, and boom, she's thrust into this situation where she has to like question literally everything, for the sake of her daughter. What is going on? How could this possibly be? So it's really interesting, and we're never going to get to the end of the conversation as humans. Yeah.
Right. No. Yeah. Definitely. So for a less serious question, do you like pea soup?
That is far less serious than what we said. I do not like pea soup, probably thanks to The Exorcist.
Right.
Probably thanks to the fact that although I like to wear green, I typically don't eat it very much except avocados. I'm not a big pea soup fan. I confess, my wife and my stepdaughter will eat split pea soup all the time. And
oh, really?
I look at it, it just looks like this, horrific baby food contraption thing. I don't know. It just looks awful to me. I don't like it. So thumbs down on the pea soup, vomit or otherwise. I would
right. This question, hopefully, I kind of intended it to be a little funny, but it may not be. But you mentioned we both have daughters who both are teenagers. But is there a moment, or when was there a moment when you have been most scared of your daughter?
Most scared of my daughter?
Yes.
Or not for, but of, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, she's definitely being a young teenager foraying into the world of being 13. There have definitely been those Reagan moments where, you enter her sacred domain, her room, and she gives you the Reagan possessed eyes, like, what the hell are you doing here? It's very different from 7-year-old, stepdaughter who's like grabbing your legs when you first, come in from work and you're like, oh, hello. And you wrestle with her. Yeah. And now it's more like, Wednesday Addams. Like, don't bother me today. I haven't had my coffee. Things like that. So I don't know, that feeling scared of her. That's a really funny question. I don't feel scared of her, but I definitely respect hormones. I respect hormones. I respect the path that she's on, and I don't want to get in the way of that.
Yeah. What I thought of that made me think of this question is, this movie, but so this was several years back, and Hallie, she still deals with allergies, and we're still trying to figure out certain stuff. But the doctor recommended for her to get on Singular, and anyway, we didn't think about it at the time, but like her mood was just like, it was almost probably equivalent to like how you hear about moody teenagers, but this was like 4 or 5 years ago. And we were just like what? And like, we'd be like, and she's always like, if Hallie, she is so just good spirited and always happy. But in the morning, we like ask her, hey, do you want some cereal? And she'd be like, yes. And we were like, oh, okay. Like it really was like Satan. That. Yeah. And she was like snapping at my mother-in-law all the time, and they usually relationship. And so we finally called the doctor talking more about the behavior. We didn't link it to that. And then she asked the medication question, and we mentioned the Singular, and she's like, yes, take her off that Singular like right away. Wow. No and joke. If you look, it's just a side effect that does happen. And almost like pretty much like right when we took her off of it, she was completely Hallie again. It was so bizarre. So anyway, but even at that time, we would kind of joke about that. Like, we have like Linda Blair in our house.
Priest and a new priest.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what I always think about. So anyway,
and teenagers have so much to go through with their hormones and with puberty anyway, and pressures at school, that when they come home, that's their safe place to be, Reagan, if they want to be.
Right.
And so I understand the mood swings. It's going to happen most of the time. Chloe's mood swings are not really all that big of a deal. She's a very pleasant girl, and she's very fun to be around. But she does have her moments where I'm like, oh, I better approach cautiously, like she might be a velociraptor.
Right. Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up this movie, I do think this is a movie you could poses lots of questions, and you could go on and on about them. I think as a movie, it's just that lexicon of horror movies. It's certainly, if you like horror movies, you have to see this movie. It is, because of its graphic nature, it's not something I would just recommend to somebody, because it is, even now watching it today, some of the scenes that happen, especially as someone of faith, and the things that happen in it are quite revealing, but it's just still very, very effective 50 years later, for sure.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the greats, if not the great horror movie. Going back to your original question, do you think it's the best? And I do tend to think that it is probably at least in the top 3 best ever made. Just for its subtleties and its extremism and its the quality of filmmaking, the sound design, all of it just wrapped together into this extremely memorable experience.
Yeah. And I think besides the fact that it's very, it was made of the 70s, so it does have that kind of film look to it, but we didn't talk about a whole lot, but just the effects of it. It really is a movie that holds up, I think, from that standpoint of even the scene where she's levitating off the bed still just looks flawless.
So great. Yeah. In fact, levitation scenes in devil demon possession movies these days, there's it's so oversaturated in the market. Seeing that kind of thing, the person crab walking up the ceiling or levitating, it does not hold any power to me whatsoever. When I see that in a Conjuring movie, for example, I don't care. I don't care if I'm seeing them levitate. It does nothing for me anymore, because the original Mac Daddy movie did it better.
Right.
Like she didn't have to be crawling on the wall. She just levitated about 3 feet off the bed, and I was freaked out for days.
Yeah. So that's Brad's review of this movie, the Mac Daddy of horror movies.
The Mac Daddy.
Recommendations.
Okay, so anything else that you like to recommend that you are just enjoying these days?
I mean, I've been reading just lots of great novels these days. I'm more of a reader than I am a watcher these days. But
yeah,
but my wife and I are watching The Fall of the House of Usher, Mike Flanagan's.
Yeah, I've heard good things about it.
Really, really loving that right now. So I would highly recommend watching The Fall of the House of Usher. We've been Mike Flanagan fans for a long time now. Ever since I saw Oculus, by the way.
Okay,
I've been a Mike Flanagan just fanatic. So. Yeah, I mean, that and the Goosebumps series is very fun. It's for slightly older audiences, hits a lot of the nostalgic buttons. I haven't really been able to see a whole lot of films in the theater. I did recently see Talk to Me, which was fantastic. I think that's definitely one of the great movies of the past 3 years in terms of horror. Yeah, so I don't know. I need to get back to the horror roots again and just get in there and just start, nose diving into the horror movies again. But here lately, I've just been doing a lot more reading than anything.
Yeah.
Priming the pump for that novel I'm writing, I guess.
Right. My recommendation is actually another podcast, but it's simply called Grapevine. It's behind the NBC News team that made the South Lake podcast. Are you familiar with these two series that came out?
Yeah, heard of it.
Yeah. So the South Lake actually won a Peabody Award, but it's kind of you could listen to Grapevine without listening to the other and vice versa, but it's probably helpful to listen to South Lake first. It was released in 2021 and was a story of the racial and cultural disputes that divided the suburb of South Lake. And this all takes place in North Texas. And we lived in Arlington for a couple of years, so we kind of know those communities. But this one, Grapevine, it's 6 episodes, but it's basically, it talks about how it's this teacher and there's a transgender teenager who are caught up in the crossfire of the Grapevine Colleyville School District's anti-trans policy. So it just kind of goes deep into that, and it's just it's super. Maybe kind of going off what we were talking about, some of the religious themes, and good versus evil. It's actually, it
always creeps in, doesn't it?
Yeah. There's no help me or pea soup involved in this podcast, but it's very fascinating. The episodes are only about 30 minutes each, so it's a really fast listen.
I'll check that out.
Yeah, it's really, really good. So that's my recommendation. So next week we're going to either be jumping back into the 50 greatest rom-coms list to cover 13 going on 30, or at some point it'll be the latest Martin Scorsese crime thriller, Killers of the Flower Moon. I was able to watch that this past week. So we're lining up fun guests for each one. So I'm not quite sure which one's going to come first, but we're going to probably cover both of those films in some way, some form or another. So also, I'm real excited because I've been working on some new things for the podcast. One is a super easy way to donate and support the podcast. So if you go to our website, there's an easy donate link button. And I'll also put it in the description of this episode, but it'll link to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. And on that site, you can easily give a one-time donation, or better yet, you can choose to become a monthly subscriber to the podcast. So if you love what we do, please consider making a cheerful and generous donation to help us continue making the world of movies come to life. And as always, our website is moviesaretlife.com. So you can find all our episodes, reviews, like my review for Killers of the Flower Moon and more. So if you love this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it. And that always helps us find new listeners. I really appreciate you, Brad, for coming on and diving into this dark journey.
Absolutely. It's always so much fun talking with you about this stuff, man. We should do it more.
I know. If only there wasn't miles and miles of road between us. It'd be fun to do this in person sometime.
It would. Yeah, we should make that happen. It would be fun.
Yeah. You're going to go to the Last Bedlam game?
I will not. I think we're probably going to be hitting up a haunted house in Ponca City while that's going on, in keeping with form and tradition.
Well, see, you're showing your true colors, because that's actually not until like November 5th. So I don't know if the haunted house
that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. It's homecoming this weekend. No, that's what we're going to be missing.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Bedlam is tempting. I've been getting homecoming and Bedlam like screwed up in my heads, but yeah, this weekend we're going to be doing the haunts, and next weekend I'm actually going to be going on a writer's retreat.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, sadly no Bedlam for me then either, but hold the fort down for us. Go Pokes. Sorry, Nathan. And yeah, see you in the trenches there.
Yeah, there you go. Well, so next time, just remember to lock your doors, check under your bed before you go to sleep tonight, and keep a close eye on your crucifix. Okay.
For sure.
Okay. Have a good one.
Thank you. See you, Nathan.